Hello and welcome again to my videos about using Yi version 2, and in this video we're going to look at the first steps that you'll take after you've installed Yi 2, and in this case the basic application template. In the last video we got as far as installing the template and running it up, and it looks kind of like this looks in Firefox. And the only thing that I've done on top of that since the last video is I've installed an application called Netbeans to use as my development environment. And I use Netbeans because it works very well with PHP, it's very stable, and it's a free download as well. So you'll need to install a JDK, a Java development kit, if you don't have one, and it needs to be version 7 or greater. The current latest version is 8, so you'll need to download one of those in order to use Netbeans because it's a Java app. But once that's installed, what I've done is I've created a new project, and in Netbeans what you can do is you can click File, New Project, and under the PHP category, which you should have if you downloaded the correct version, you can pick a PHP application with existing sources, and then you can point it at your Yi application at the root directory of that, and then everything will pull in to the IDE as you see here. So we're currently looking at the default template, so this is what they give you for free. And one of the first things I'm going to do, just to make it a bit neater, is I'm going to tidy up these URLs, because by default this uses the full root syntax for finding controllers and models inside our site, even with a little %2 in there just to be even more ugly, or %2f. And so what we're going to do is we're going to open our web configuration. Now we're going to look through these folders in a second, but under your base folder config is a file called web.php, and in here we're going to set URL manager, and this is underneath the components array. We're going to add an entry for URL manager, which is not there by default. We're going to set this field enable pretty URL to true, and what that means now is if we go back to the site, we can see that we have a much neater syntax, and using URL rewriting or htaccess in Apache or whatever you want to use, you can also, if you want, get rid of index.php, but I'm not going to bother with that for now. I think this is neat enough to be getting on with. And as you can see, we end up with a home page, an about page with a couple of instructions in, and an example of a contact form and an example of a login page. And it's worth noting that the basic template has a couple of quite big differences from the advanced template, which you can also install. And it's worth looking at the advanced template because the basic template has some hard-coded user accounts, and they're in code, they're not in the database. And so this is really quite a basic example and probably not something that you would use in a production website. Whereas in the advanced template, they actually include by default a user database table and a sign up and a login form that all use the correct normal kind of production user login system, using all of the kind of Yi built-in classes. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, then by all means install an advanced template site alongside this, and you can obviously look at both sets of code and see what the differences are. The other difference is in the advanced template, the configuration is much more complex because it has a front end and a separate back end website, which each have their own configurations. And it also has a common configuration where you can set things common to both. But in addition to that, they also have this idea of environments, which you might use for development, for user acceptance testing, for pre-delivery testing, for production, or whatever. So you'll find lots and lots of configuration files in the advanced template, so don't get too confused by that. But let's take a quick look through the structure for the main, the basic template, which we've just installed. And most of these folders we won't need to use that much. You'll probably be able to guess which ones we will use. assets is used for pre-compiling JavaScript and CSS, so we don't tend to do very much in that. And in the commands folder, again, we have this an example of basically an API type function that you can call on the command line, but again, we're probably not going to use that, but the example's in there. In the configuration, we have the console configuration, which is separate from the web configuration, and that's because some of the things that you might want to do on the console you don't want to expose when the website is in production, so you can separate those two configurations up. That's how they're separated to begin with. And if you want to know exactly what's going to happen when you run your site, if you look into the index here, you'll see that it loads the web configuration, and so you'll know which one it needs to use. The console one is used by things like the migration scripts and stuff like that, which we'll look at in a minute. So we'll be doing a lot of work inside web, particularly, and inside console. And the basic layout of these configurations is the same. The two parts that we'll use most often are the modules array and the components array, and a lot of what we do in Yi involves modifying those. And obviously, because these are text files, just be a bit careful when you're editing them, because obviously you're not going to get any particular error sensing if you spell things incorrectly or get commas in the wrong place or whatever. Parameters are effectively system-wide values that you might want to use. So if you're going to use the admin email, for example, in lots of different pages, rather than copying and pasting it, you can add entries to this array, and then they're available in code using Yi : params. So that's quite useful. The DB connection, what actually happens in the web configuration, you'll notice, is that the database, rather than being configured directly in this file, which it could be, it's instead saying use this db.php instead, and so it just gives us a nice neat place to set up our connection. As you can see, it's created a local connection string by default, but clearly if you haven't got MySQL installed, then probably none of this is going to work right now anyway. Since this is a MVC, a model view controller framework, you'll find the obvious controllers directory as well as models and views. And if we look here at the minute, we only have a single controller. And if we look under the models, all of the models are kind of flattened in this directory. And in the case of site, there is no site model because the site is obviously not a data entity, it's the actual website itself. But usually we will have one controller in here, usually one model to go with that controller, and then under views we will have a folder for each controller, and then all the different views associated to that controller. So clearly in our website we have a site about, site contact, site error, site index, site login, which we can see on here. If we click these different buttons, we can see all of those come under the site controller. Obviously we can choose whatever names we want for those controllers. These are just the defaults. We then have a whole mail setup, and we're not going to go into that yet. I might look at that in a future video. Migrations is something we'll look at a bit later in this video, but effectively the migrations allow you to control your database using source control. And what you do is you create scripts in migrations that create database entities, and then the Yi command line program can run those migrations against your database, and that makes it easy for you to create new objects in the database, to put them into source control, and for other developers to take those changes and run them against their own copies of the database. The runtime folder has all of our kind of logs in it, our performance logs. The app log is where errors and stuff will be logged, which is all kind of fairly obvious. Tests, if you end up creating unit tests, they will all live under here. Again, I won't look at that this time. Vendor is a directory for Composer, and if you remember from the previous video, Yi2 uses Composer to manage not just Yi itself, but any of the extra packages as well. So the vendor directory is the default location for all of those Composer packages, and you'll notice that even the Yi framework itself lives under vendor because it gets pulled in as a Composer package. So this YiSoft/Yi2 is where you'll find most of the classes that you use in your applications. So that's there for information. You can also use Control B in Netbeans, and that will take you to the definition of a function if you're trying to find it. Views we've already talked about. With layouts basically apply across a whole range of sites. So in this case, we can set the main HTML entities that will be used on all of our pages, and potentially we could have, you know, navigation bars or footers or whatever we want, and we can define a number of layouts if we want, but for now we'll just stick with the default layout. The site, as we said, are just all the views for the site controller, and then web is actually the directory that should be visible on your web server. So all of these other folders and files up here will be pulled in by the file system, but none of these should be visible to the website, only this web level and below. And then what Index does is by using, you know, .. it can pull in files from outside of the web root. And if you look, there's very little in here. We have some CSS, the precompiled assets in there, and that's about it. And then in the root of our directory we have this, which is the Yi script, which does various different things for us, and a couple of other. Composer is what the Composer script uses to know what's going on. So again, we can configure things in here about dependencies and everything else. So the very first thing that we're probably going to want to do is to link this up with a database. And as we've seen already, there is already a database configuration script. And so our first question is, what type of database are we going to use and where is it going to live? We obviously haven't got time now to talk about all the different combinations of database that you could use. But one of the things that works very well in Yi is using a database engine called Sqlite. And the idea of Sqlite is that the database exists as a single file on the local file system and doesn't actually need any installation other than PHP needs to have it enabled so that PHP can speak to the Sqlite database. So if we have a quick look at our PHP ini, which is file, open file. If we look at here, we will see that there are a range of PDO, which are basically PHP data objects. It's a common interface for databases. And when I noticed that PHP comes bundled with some extensions, but none of them are enabled by default. But I have manually enabled the Sqlite one just to use during my development. So there are a couple of different ways that you can use the database when you're first starting out. You can either create the database, create your tables in the database, and then generate models directly from those. Or what you can do is you can use migrations, which we will look at later. And migrations allows you to write code to create and populate those database tables, after which you can then generate models and controllers from those. And you might want to do either. You'll have to have a think about the best way to do that, because going forwards you're going to need to be able to maintain this. You're going to need to make sure that different developers have copies of the same database tables and everything else. So you could use migrations, or you could start by perhaps creating a basic schema in your database. You could potentially export that as a SQL script, and then you could run all your future migrations on top of that. So it's kind of up to you, but I recommend Sqlite Manager, which is a Firefox plugin, and it's a free download. And what I've done here is using new, I've created a new database called local.sqlite, and if you notice it's right there. Doesn't really matter where you put it too much. I guess in the root of the web application makes it easy to find. Bearing in mind that unless you have a very simple site, Sqlite's probably not going to be good enough for production, but it is nice and quick and easy to use for local development and testing. So we're going to go ahead and create a database table in here. So you can right click here and create a table. I'm going to create a table. Let's just invent something. Let's just say a table called book. And we're going to have a column name called ID, which is going to be an integer. And we're going to make it primary key and auto increment. It's not going to have a default. And then maybe we'll have a title, which we'll just say is a varchar. It doesn't really matter, 64. We won't allow nulls. And then we'll maybe have an author. So let's just do something fairly simple. One of the things to note about Sqlite is it doesn't support things like foreign keys and what have you. So again, it's not quite the ideal database engine for a production system, but it's usually good enough to use for the time being. So we'll say that we're not going to allow that. So we create OK. Yes, and you'll see here that we actually have a table. If we browse it, there are obviously no rows in there, but that doesn't matter for now. If we want, we can insert a row. We could just add and say, right, we're going to have a book called, Dangerous Book for Boys by, I can't remember who it's called, so let's just say his name's John Smith. We click OK, and there we have our row. So we got one entry in. We don't really need any entries to generate models, but that's all kind of set up, ready to go. And now the next thing we need to do is set up this this database connection string, so it points to the correct location for our database. So the protocol is SQLite, and we don't have a host and a database name in the usual sense, because it's just a file. So we can point it to projects basic local.sqlite. We can just point it there using a file. There are obviously no username and passwords, again, because it's a file. The child set can stay the same, that's fine. So that should now be our database connection set up correctly. Now what we can do is I want to introduce you now to the next thing that you'll tend to use to create your models and controllers, and that's a tool called GII, G-I-I, and by default it's enabled if the development variable is enabled, so it's there by default. And if we go back to our website, we'll find if we do index.php/GII, you'll see that we're straight into this code generator. And in this case, we could do a whole load of things, but just for now I'm not going to get too much into the whole model view controller generation, but we'll start just with the basic model generator. And we're going to say, right, my table name is book. You notice that this has actually gone and looked into the database and found the names of the tables, so that already knows that there's a table called book. And model class I'm going to call book with a capital B, and because Yi2 uses namespaces quite a lot, we've got a choice here of how we namespace these models. So if we go and have a look in here, say user, you'll notice that the base namespace is app/models. Depending on how big a site we expect to have, we could create new folders under here, and then by convention we should then extend the namespace, so we could have app/books/models, or sorry, app/models/books, or something like that. So we could change that if we wanted to. And our base class is going to be active record. The database connection by default is DB. You can have more than one database connection defined if you want and use them for different things, but at the minute we've just got one. That's worth ticking, because what you can optionally do in Yi is you can set a table prefix, and that is so that you can have multiple sites sharing the same database. We just tick that by default, and then if there is a table prefix, it will be used. Generate relations doesn't work with Sqlite, but what that does is it looks at the foreign keys that are found in, say, MySQL or SQL Server databases, and it will generate you the relations in code, so that you can say things like user arrow groups, arrow permissions, or whatever, and actually build up a whole load of relationships directly, which is quite useful. And again, if you use DB comments, you can label your fields with nice readable labels, and enabling this just means you can support internationalization later. So if you hit preview, what it will do is it will say at the bottom what it's going to create, and it will say, well, I'm going to create a file called book.php in the models directory, and this is green because it means the file doesn't exist already. If there was already a book.php, it would go orange, and you would have the option to overwrite it or not. And if it existed but it was actually the same file, then it would be grey, and then you could ignore the change. But I'm happy with that, and I'm going to hit generate. And so if we just pop back into here now, we'll notice there's now a new model called book. And this is actually all set up and ready to go. I don't have to change anything in it. But you'll see that it's pulled out a couple of rules automatically. So it looked at the length of the varchar fields in the database table and realized that they have a max length of 64. So that rule has come in. And it's also looked at these two are set to not allow null values, in which case they are both required. And those rules are useful later. Now, in terms of the attribute labels, what it's basically saying here is, if the field is ID, what do I want to display to the user? Now, we don't usually display ID numbers, but ID is probably okay. And title and author, they're only one word. They're probably okay as they are. But, you know, we might, for instance, want this to be, you know, book author or something like that. But they are up to you. And what this is it's a translation function, which means that if we're running in a different language than English, then these will be sent off to the translation mechanism, and they might come back in another language. So we have a model. It's fairly small, fairly easy to understand, clearly tells what the table name is, and that % character is just saying if there is a table prefix, then you should use the table prefix. And the other thing you'll notice is some PHP magic properties have been created, and that means if we create a class of type book in Netbeans, for instance, then it will know that book has an ID, a title, and an author. Even though they're not real properties, they don't exist here in code, they're magical properties that will get wired up at runtime to those fields in the database. So that's the basic model generation, and you can see how the database and the connection is all very easy. So the last thing we're going to look at in this video is just a quick look at migrations and what they are. So let's skip forwards and assume that our website has been finished, it's been deployed, it's in production, and I need to fix something on this website. Now I go and I look in the database and I say, well, there's a table called book, but I need to add another column to that table. Now clearly I don't want to go to a live production website and just add another column, not just without having any kind of process or any kind of testing or whatever. So I kind of want to add another column to it in a controlled way. And what I can do is I can use migrations to perform that. So at the minute that migrations folder is empty, but if I go to the command line and I'm in the root of my web application, and if I say ye migrate /create, you can do other things as well as create, like drop and delete and stuff. If I want to create a new migration, I can then give it a descriptive name. So I might say add description to book table. Can be whatever you want, and it'll say, are you sure you want to do it? And I say yes please, and then you'll notice back here that a file has been created which contains a date and then the description that I gave it. Now the reason the date and the time are important is that every migration you create will come, the newer ones will come after the older ones because of that numbering, and that means that the migrations can be added to the database. So if I look in here, there are two functions that are created for me. There's up and down. There is also a safe up and safe down function which are not implemented by default. And the safe versions are useful for if you're creating more than one object at a time or deleting more than one object at a time, then you want to wrap them all in a transaction. And what that means is if one of them fails, you want the whole thing to fail. So you can use safe up and safe down for that. But whereas if you don't need a transaction, it's quicker not to have a transaction. And here in code, what we can do is we can use the various functions in migration to do whatever it is we need to do. So we could do $this, add column, and the table definition will be the one that we already saw earlier, which is that. The column that I'm going to add, we have to be a little bit careful with the word description because it can get confused with the desk of descending, or sometimes the word description is a keyword in a database, so I'm going to avoid that and just call it book desk. And in terms of type, there is a class called schema, and schema defines some types for me so that I don't have to worry too much about it. Now the description is not going to be massive, so I think we'll go with string. Now that equates to varchar, so then I need to add the size of it, so let's just say 256 characters. I could add not null if I wanted to, otherwise I can just do this, which is fairly straightforward. And then here, sometimes you can't undo what you've done in the up function. So if you've if this drops a table, although you could recreate it, that's not really a reversal of dropping a table, because dropping a table removes all the rows as well. So sometimes you can't go down once you've gone up, in which case you return false, and trying to go down will then fail. But in my case, I've added a column, so clearly if I want to undo this, all I need to do is drop the column, or it might be called delete. No, drop column, and again I could do my %book, and then the column I want to drop is going to be called book desk. Okay, so what you should hopefully be able to see now is I've actually got a file that has a database change in it in code. I could obviously do a lot more than this. I could add rows and columns, I could insert data and delete data, could kind of do whatever I need to do. But just for demonstration purposes, you can see what's going to happen here. And now what I need to do is I need to migrate up. So if I do ye migrate, now what's important here is this is going to be using the console configuration to find the database. So I need to make sure that the database is the same connection string, which it is because it pulls in that common file, which is great. And if I do ye migrate, it will look in the database and it will see if any migrations are outstanding. In this case, it knows that there is one outstanding and asks, do I want to apply it? It will ask me this for everyone that's in the directory, and I say yes, and it says migrated up successfully. So if we just take a quick look in here, and if we go to the structure, we look here and we can see what we're looking for as a book desk column, and if I browse and search, we can see that, if I refresh that, well, there is no description, which is why it's not showing me that, but you can see that we have a book description field in there now, and if I go to this line and edit it, I could say this is a book for boys or something, and okay, and now it's because it's obviously already saved the columns, so I can't show you the other column, but we know it's in there and the book desk is in there. Clearly if we did that, we would then need to go into our model at the same time, and we would have to add our extra property in here. We would need to add any more rules for it. We'd need to add any attribute labels, so we could clearly do all of that at the same time. But importantly, I could then check that into source control. Any other developers could run that same migration, and then they get all of the changes that I've applied. And then if they were to run migration again, because there is a migrations table in the database, the migration tool knows that there's nothing left to apply, and then we know that we've applied everything. The other thing that we can do is we can also go down, and it will say, right, the last one you applied is that, do you want to undo it? So if I said yes, it may or may not work. It's got an error, but I don't know what it's got an error for. Oh, drop column is not supported by Sqlite. Okay, so that wouldn't work in Sqlite anyway. But that's fine. Hopefully you get the idea there of how you can use migrations, and you could have tens or hundreds of these migrations in the directory. The main thing is that migrate uses this table here to know what migrations to apply and what migrations have already been applied. So that's that. You've now seen how to set up the database config using Sqlite to point to a local file. You've seen using Sqlite Manager how to create tables and insert data into that local Sqlite. We've seen the GUI model generator and how it generates models from the database tables, and we've had a little look at the migrations. So in my next video, I'll be looking at a basic model view and controller setup for our new model, our new book model. And you can see again how it's very quick, very easy to do, and you just get so much stuff out of the box with Yi2. So happy hacking, and I will hopefully see you again soon.